president of Society of Professional Journalists. I would like to invite you, if you like this event, to like us on Facebook at SPJ at CSUS chapter. Right now, I'd like to also introduce our moderator, and also in partnership with the State Hornet, we have the advisor and moderator of the State Hornet, Stu Van Aersdale.
Hi, thank you so much for coming. Really appreciate it. It's great to see all of you here. Welcome to this special event with Sam Amick. As Bryce mentioned, I'm in fact the advisor of the State Hornet here in Sacramento State. It's a 70-year-old institution. It's covered everything going on right here on campus. We have a great group right now. We hope to see all of you there. If you're interested, we'd love to have you. You have a copy of State Hornet, so you can go ahead and reach out to editors, let us know how you can get involved. We will get you involved. All right, but that's now. State Hornet also has a grand tradition. A lot of alums came out there. I came out of the State Hornet. Timmy came out of the State Hornet. We have several different State Hornet alums around here and current members. And one of our most illustrious alums is the gentleman you're about to meet. He is the National NBA Writer Insider, I believe is the fancy word for it. And he has earned that distinction through really piercing insights, incredible sourcing, great contacts, and just an amazing writer, all-around great reporter. We're so thrilled to have him here to talk to you about what he does and how you, perhaps, can do it yourself. Sam Amick.
Thank you. Good to see you again. Thanks for having me, guys.
Sam, welcome.
Thank you. Am I sitting? Am I standing? What do you need?
Have a seat.
All right.
Have a seat. So, we can start a number of places, but I got to ask you, what happened on All-Star Weekend? It sounds like you had a
Sure.
little bit of you got tweeted and you got retweeted.
I got tweeted. First of all, it's funny because I'm not late, but I was cutting it closer. I don't know the campus like I used to. I'm over by the parking lot, by the football field, Googling Sac State Campus Mag images. God dang it, where's Riverside? I forgot how to get to Riverside. So we're back. We're rusty. Some awesome memories for me here. But to your question, Stu, All-Star Weekend was wild from a journalistic standpoint. And one of the things that it reminded me of, and I have a few familiar faces in the crowd here because I taught Professor Reese's class a couple weeks ago, and we were brushing up on all the journalistic basics and getting into sports media. So I go off to All-Star Weekend in LA, and I got reminded yet again of how different this job can be. Anybody who thinks that it's, do we watch a lot of games? 100%. In person, on TV, is that a major part of it? Absolutely. But we go to All-Star Weekend, and the day before I get to LA, Fox News host Laura Ingraham you guys know the story. She had popped off on her show in this in my opinion, ridiculous shut up and dribble segment that was incredibly offensive to essentially, not only an entire race and anybody who appreciates diversity, but to the NBA player community. So I get to LA, and I think so that's on Friday. And from the journalistic side of things, I do take a lot of pride and enjoy trying to connect with these athletes as people and give them our microphone when I think it's fit. And this certainly applied when it comes to, this kind of a story. So Kevin Durant was doing a charity event in Culver City. And the synergy the timing was perfect because here you have a mainstream right-wing media host claiming that nobody who's not a politician is allowed to have a voice. And not only that, but her entire premise was shut up and dribble. The next day, Kevin Durant was making a choice to not shut up and dribble and to help in the community. There was an organization, Baby to Baby is the name of the charity company. They essentially make sure that low-income families, they get diapers, they get everything they need. Bottom line, Kevin could have been hanging out at All-Star Weekend just enjoying himself, that's his right. But he spent, time, he spent money to be out there giving back to the community. So Kevin and I connected, and I've dealt with him for a long time. I covered him going all the way back to his rookie year in Seattle. And so with that, and we'll get into this stuff, with that comes relationship and rapport and trust and things of that nature. And so that day, I essentially, it wasn't just Kevin who you're talking to say, what do you think? Do you want to take this thing on? And before we do the interview, you are trying to get on the same page. And I'm trying to gauge him to say, you pick and choose, guys, when you insert yourself into it, but I did tell him, I think you should speak up. I think you need to say something, but it's not my place. Then you're coordinating with Warriors PR because they were on the scene. Then you're coordinating with NBA PR. There's a lot of hands on the cookie jar as you try to navigate access. So bottom line, we end up doing the interview. I thought he handled it really well. He just was a nice combination of, assertive, well-spoken, but also just like he took the high road, and he ended up, I thought it worked out well. And then a couple hours later, LeBron had seen a tweet that was connected to that story. There is, not to get too far in the weeds, but there's a company called Uninterrupted that LeBron is invested in. It's a media company. And I was in LA and I walked into, this is the same day, I walked into their lobby and they have a neon sign that typifies their message and it says, "I am more than just an athlete." I just thought it was cool. And admitted, I know people who work there. I didn't have permission technically to be there. I had kind of just popped in and I saw the sign and I snapped a shot and I tweeted it with a link to the Kevin Durant Q&A. And somebody I know texted it to LeBron. He tweeted it, it certainly went viral and it was enjoyable. I mean, for what we do, is it fun to cover Game 7 of the finals? Sure. But those are the kinds of things, not to get too corny, but those are the kinds of things that are fun for me individually because I like basketball and you feel lucky to do this job. That kind of a story was, as you could imagine, rewarding because it's bigger than basketball and it's, and it resonates in a neat way. And it's the product of, we'll talk relationships, but it's the product of having dealt with a certain guy for so many years and, figuring out how to do this job and try to do it the right way. So, and there was even more that we'll get into on All-Star Weekend, but that was the big one.
All right,
Yeah.
cool. So how much of your job is having to just kind of grapple with social media right now and stay up to speed on these events and kind of weigh the judgment do I tweet this?
Sure.
Because you picked up a ton of followers from this. People are now turning to you as kind of a, the authority on social media. So, you have to be really careful about what you tweet and careful about how you
100%, yeah.
represent that power?
Yes is the answer. It's also crazy how quickly it's changed where Twitter is the epicenter for journalists. In fact, our social media director is a lady named Alex Patachik. She does a great job, and I give her a hard time because she's, I'm 40, she's in her mid-20s, and I tell her, you're the most powerful person in the whole organization. I'm just going to do whatever you tell me to do, and that's how I'm going to stay employed. And she gives me a hard time because it's true that Twitter, are there readers and fans and followers on Twitter? Certainly, but it's journalist headquarters. She had called it the cesspool of journalists, and she was kidding, but it's that means that it becomes a ticker. It becomes like The Wire in the old days, where anything you say becomes part of the record. And so, if you're watching a game and, Steph Curry recently said his social media policy personally was, it's not real complicated. If you look at it, you just got to take a quick beat, look at it twice, and if it gives you any reason for pause, that's it. That pause tells you hit delete. Don't send it. So on his level, where everything is going to be a story no matter what he says, that would certainly apply. But even for folks in the media, I think 100% is you are constantly trying to figure out, how to balance the opinion versus good old, reporting straightforward facts. One of the latest offshoots of this discussion there's not really a rule book for this is the whole shut up and dribble story is obviously social political, right? Well, you have, sports media tweeting political views. In the old days, that would be, and I see my old B colleague over here, Mr. Reese, that would be a complete no-no. You're getting in trouble from the newspaper powers that be right away. Now, it's just, things are a little bit different. A buddy of mine who writes for Bleacher Report, Howard Beck, does an amazing job, spent most of his career at the New York Times, one of the flagship media platforms. By all accounts, a conventional journalist. Now that he's at Bleacher Report, he is the most prolific political tweeter probably in all of sports media. He's constantly, tweeting about the president, things, and his outfit is different. His company is different. So, you're always policing it, and I think you need to also be cognizant of, you try to control power is the wrong word, but just the impact of your voice. It's just, if you dilute people too much, if you tweet too much, if you say too many things that are not of broad interest, and you go too far down different pipelines that are only of interest to you, I think you just generally have less impact with readers.
How do you do that?
How do you mean?
How do you moderate what you do? How do do you have like a tweet quota per day or?
No, and I'm probably, I feel like I'm in the middle ground. Like to pick both ends of the spectrum, I'm just gonna anecdotally pick a couple of people who come to mind. A guy who does a great job for ESPN, Adrian Wojnarowski, breaks a ton of news, almost everything. And he's on the one extreme when it comes to, he essentially only tweets when it's cold hard news. And so if you follow him and you just want to cut through everything and just tell me if somebody's getting traded, tell me if somebody's signing somewhere else, most of the time you got maximum impact for that kind of a story. Now the opposite extreme is another colleague and friend, Matt Moore, who used to be at CBS Sports, now is it's kind of a sports / gambling website called Action Sports Network. But Matt, like All-Star Weekend, I was having dinner with Matt and another writer. They are friends in person, and that person told Matt that he said, Matt, I love you, but I had to unfollow you because you tweet too damn much. Like and if you look at his tweet count, it's just insane. So he's literally like, I had eggs for breakfast, and it's over the top. And so I feel like I'm a happy medium, but you try to check that stuff. And you can also, you're always gauging response, right? That's the beauty of the Twitter mentions is I've gotten better at not responding like I used to because it's just, there's no upside really in responding, but you'll gauge it. If you got a whole stream of folks basically giving you like a meh, and it's just, they didn't, enjoy what you offered, then maybe rethink that next time.
Do you think that the access to your readers and vice versa that Twitter and other social media allow is a good thing for you?
I do. Sorry guys, I'm a little dry. But I'm subjective for this reason. I'm always going to have a soft spot for Twitter because if you go back, I didn't get into much of my story. If you go back to 2010, I left the Bee, and it was a calculated risk. There was a website called AOL Fan House, and essentially they, from the old dial-up networking days, they had a bunch of leftover money, and they poured it into this sports website trying to compete with ESPN. And they were throwing some money around to newspaper writers who they thought did a nice job. So I got this job offer. And it was I thought about it for like 2-3 months. They waited. It was really flattering. I finally take it. And about, I guess it was a year in, I signed a 3-year contract that I learned the hard way. Another word of advice, have an attorney look at all your stuff if you ever, because it was a 3-year contract that was barely worth the paper it was printed on. And so a year in, they pulled the plug on the entire outfit just because they pulled the plug. So 90-something people got laid off at once, and I was one of them. Twitter, I've always contended, was a lifeline to the next opportunity because if this had happened to me in 1992 or before Twitter, then you lose that connection to the public. You lose, you're just an unemployed journalist at this point, as opposed to I pivoted, and these are now like fond memories. I pivoted and I made my own website called NBAconfidential.com. I crossed my fingers every day that and I'm not really kidding, like I thought NBA Legal was gonna shut it down. Like every day I was just waiting for the phone to ring because I was technically speaking not supposed to use the NBA's name. Again, relationships, I was later told by some of their people like, well, we knew you were in a tough spot and no offense, but you weren't exactly stealing traffic from NBA.com, But that, like Twitter and NBA Confidential kept me afloat, and I kept hustling to try to look for the next opportunity, and that was Sports Illustrated after that. Mm-hmm. But the whole time, I broke stories when I was technically unemployed, and tweeted news, and I tried to keep the same profile with Twitter as the avenue. So, I am an advocate for it. Is a larger conversation to be had about like a unhealthy level of self-importance that goes on there? For sure. It becomes, especially Twitter, media folks trying to one-up each other with different opinions, points of view, but I like the directness of it. It's always funny when you meet like someone who you've interacted with forever on Twitter in person, because they're just like an emoji in your head, and then they're real. So yeah, I enjoy it though. And now, I mean, the question now is like, where's the threshold? Because last year I was, and this is the same social media director, Alex. She had said, all right, well, if you're gonna follow my lead, she's like, you got to do Snapchat. And so I was all in, and I had fun with Snapchat, and all my colleagues were mad at me because they're like, you're setting a terrible precedent here, because now, like, you're the favorite student doing Snapchat, but then within 6 months, they're like, oh, now we're pivoting to Instagram. Now it's Instagram. It's always changing. But I enjoy it. It's fun.
All right, cool.
Yeah.
Well, you mentioned the beginnings. Let's go back to the beginning. How did you get into this racket in the first place?
The beloved State Hornet
Right.
that you mentioned. I'm not kidding. I'm going to sit here and be like the PR guy for the Hornet, because it honestly, as much as I appreciated my degree from here, it's a journalism degree. Sylvia Fox, Michael Fitzgerald at that time were heading up the department, and they did a great job, and I certainly learned the basics of journalism, not sports journalism, but journalism from them. But without the Hornet, I wouldn't be doing this. So how I got into it was freshman year, I wanted to kind of tinker with the Hornet, so I roll into the office and ask if I can help, and they end up sending me down the news path, and I went and covered a convention to essentially discuss the problems with homelessness in the city of Sacramento.
Wow.
And
when was this? What year?
You gotta make me feel old. 96.
All right.
Yeah, 96, or like early 97.
Okay.
So they, I kind of just do what they tell me, and they send me to downtown Sac. There was a church down there, and and I don't know what I'm doing. I'm gonna sit in the back of the church and listen to the convention and figure out what I'm doing. And I still have the first published article I ever wrote, and it's in the Hornet. I framed it, and it's and it's not about sports. It's about homelessness. But the takeaway was, as meaningful as that topic was, it just didn't get me going. The event itself, it would have been one thing if it was like a robust, passionate, civic, event. It wasn't. It was a handful of people just discussing courteously within a church, and admittedly, I'm in the back going, all right, this is really not my jazz, I'm not. So I kind of tabled the Hornet for a while. I just kept studying, kept going to class, but I wasn't doing any actual writing. Not till junior year did my sports story is not, I basically had an epiphany that it was like, you know what, I think it's okay to do something you enjoy. Like, I'm a huge, huge sports fan. I grew up like one of those guys that, I played competitively, but I just was never good enough to play in college, and I played baseball, football, basketball, wrestling, and I loved it. And then that moment comes when you realize that you have a zero future in any of those, And so then junior year was when I was like, I remember thinking like how foreign of a concept it was. I don't know why, just that idea of writing about sports. Like, it's too good to be true, I guess, is what I'm trying to get at, is how it felt. So junior year, I go back into the Hornet office, same type of thing, basically just volunteer. And I'm sure you have students all the time who just come in and say, how can I help? Yeah. But it was another awesome first learning experience. The first sports story I ever wrote, and I told you guys this story a couple weeks ago, it was women's rowing. So it's not exactly what I thought I was going to be headed towards. And again, they send me out to Lake Natoma, where the team practices, and the lessons learned there still stay with me now, because they send me to a sport in a place, a sport that I don't know, in a place I'm not familiar with people who I don't know, and I'm expected to somehow come off as coherent by the time, we're putting something in print. And the coach at the time, Bill Zach, was basically could see that I had that deer in the headlights look. I didn't know what I was doing, so he pulled me into his office, and that was the first time I kind of learned the value of, like, the easiest way to cut through a lack of insight or a lack of institutional knowledge is just to talk to people and to get comfortable with somebody. So he sat me down, and it was like, all right, kid, here's how women's rowing works. And I remember her name, she still lives in Elk Grove, Becky Devshit. She's the coxswain, which is the leader of the boat. And of course, I'm sitting there going, what is that word that just came out of your mouth? Like, I don't know what that is, So that was the first sports thing. And then from there, tinkered. But I did the Hornet for 2 years. I mean, still some of my best friends in life are Hornet people, and they have their own stories where they didn't necessarily go into media, but like one of my buddies who was a columnist at the Hornet, Matt Sumter, teaches media at El Camino High School. So it's kind of neat to see the branches.
Did you always want to be a journalist?
I mean, there was like signs of it. So in high school, I went to Amador Valley High School in Pleasanton, and they had a high school paper called the Amadon because the mascot was Dons. So I remember, I forget what year, like sophomore year in high school, like the first time I, kind of got a taste of it was I did a project where I turned the Amadon into the Samadon, just super clever. It was just amazing. Like, so it was a Samadon, and it was like, an article about, I remember it was like the Niners in one corner. So it was a fake front page tinkering, but I didn't really go all in on the high school paper. I enjoyed writing, and I always just got by in math. So I'm one of those like fork in the road people that was like, when I came here, the first day I thought you had to pick a major. I didn't know I could have gone undeclared. And I literally was like, all right, let's give journalism a try. So it worked out.
Glad you did.
Yeah, me too.
What was the first, I don't know if you remember this, the first basketball game you covered, the first time you wrote about basketball for publication? What was that experience like?
Oh, man, hoops. You think that memory would be like super fresh. I mean, so Tom Abeta-Marco was the coach. I don't know if you guys know Tom he did Sacramento Kings commentating for a long time, and he was a long-time college coach. So I don't remember a game as much as I remember a similar thing where you're learning how to interact with coaches, because I remember going into Tom's office and being intimidated and like big desk, and he wasn't the biggest guy, but he's from New York, had a big presence. And so that's my first hoops memory, and quickly kind of juxtaposed with that was another, the lessons come quick when you haven't done it before. Like, he had a player named Anthony Flood who, it didn't take me long before we were covering like the first player-coach controversy, because Anthony had gotten into it and he got hurt, and he had, I think, a broken hand or a wrist, and nobody knew what had happened. And then we come to find out that he had gotten into it with his coach, and he actually punched his car window.
No way.
Yeah.
How did you find that out? What was your process?
I wish I could. I'm not gonna sit here and do a victory lap because I didn't like break it, or I don't even remember exactly what the coverage reflected. I just remember the sensitivity around, like, oh boy, now we got a coach who's trying to, and I don't blame him, trying to keep a lid on a story. This is not something I would like out, and having to navigate those waters. This will be a better story. I don't remember exactly how we covered it because I wasn't the basketball guy at the time. I forget how the beats were lined up, but I quickly learned. I mean, that's what we do. There's always that. My favorite part of this gig, that stuff like that shows you, and all these other stories, is I love sports. Sure, it's awesome, it's great, it's exciting, but like just the human component, because all that is just two people who are not enjoying each other's leadership, or the dynamic is there's friction there. And then having that play out in public is the incredible part of what we do, because the longer I do it, the more sympathetic I am to how challenging that is for the people we cover. Because I've had a tiny, tiny, tiny taste of it at different times. When you're in the media and you've been around for a little bit, then there have been different times when I remember I did a radio interview not that long ago, and I got kind of loose and I said a few things about LeBron in terms of like rumors I'd heard, and I just got a little more loose-lipped than normal. And I looked online, and there's like a blog post that took all of what I said out of context. And I was like, it was a role reversal where I'm being sympathetic to the people I cover, because that's what they deal with all the time. We talked for 5 minutes, and you guys cut it up and used the 30 seconds that worked for your story. So, try to see the other side too.
Yeah. So, what year did you get out of Sac State?
2000.
2000. Then what?
Yeah.
What did you do next?
So 2000, and then it was actually junior year at Sac State, and this applies to your question. I got a part-time job trying to think of the short version of the story. I'm working at, this is going to sound like the long version.
We have
I'm
time,
working,
Sam.
I know, I hear you. So I'm working at Safeway, because when I was in high school, we had not a Safeway, but another grocery store where I was all fired up because you got paid a little bit more than, it was like, oh, $9 an hour, we're killing here, you know.
Yeah.
So I did that in high school, and then, so I was familiar with that, so I do Safeway in college, but the problem was I was working 30-something hours a week, and the grades were struggling. I just didn't have time to study as much as I wanted to, so I was looking around saying, I've got to find a job where I'm essentially making the same money, and it's got to be more efficient on less time. So I'm scouring classified ads and all this stuff, and I find a gig selling subscriptions to the Sacramento Bee. And the job was about 16 hours a week. I would go out to grocery stores all over the area, and I had a little white booth with a bunch of free newspapers in it, and my job was to just be personable and try to basically give people a free paper, and you know the racket where it's like, hey, you want a free something, and then now they want to talk to you. And so I always try to walk this line, like I don't want to be the schmaltzy like used car salesman, but I did that job, and it worked out because I was pretty good at it, and I was making as much money as I had before. The reason that ties into my journalism story is that junior year, I start spamming newspaper departments with, you know, just communication, resumes, things like that. Well, at the Sacramento Bee, one of my mentors, Joe Davidson, was looking for a sports clerk, basically just somebody to help him with high school sports coverage. You know, in that day, the way it would work was like on Friday nights, the football game ends, and the coach would have to call it in and say, all right, Johnny had 127 yards on 17 carries, and you needed somebody to answer the phones to break this stuff down and get it in the paper and do a bunch of other stuff. So I get this gig in the sports department, and it's like it sounds like it's a nothing job, but it's a foot in the door, and it's relationships. And I get in, and to this day, Joe's one of my best friends, and he never lets me forget that he says, you know, I never hired you because you were any good. He goes, it's because you had that other job. You were the one selling subscriptions. You were already in the system. We didn't have to drug test you. Like it was just like, you know, thanks, Joe. I thought you saw something in me. But that gig was huge because then I got 2 years at the Bee, and I mean, listen, I made full use of it, and I do take pride in terms of just realizing that you're in the room, to steal the Hamilton line, like you're in the room where it happens, and you're looking around like the sports editor is a guy who I couldn't get to answer my calls before, and now, you know, I'm getting his lunch. And all these different people, so the relationships were huge. So when I get out of Sac State, I had bugged them, you know, I've been pretty aggressive about trying to write a little bit here and there, and I had written enough to where one of the main editors, Tom Negretti, had told me, like, I want to bring you on, but you have no resume. Like, I can't get this cleared. So he said, go get an internship somewhere, and I took the path of least resistance. I went down to Stockton, to the Stockton Record, and I spent a summer down there, which was another cool memory. The 49ers used to have training camp down there, so I was like, and I grew up a Niners fan, so that was kind of fun, where it was, you know, that was the Jeff Garcia Niners teams. So but like Steve Young came back, and we did media with Steve Young, and one of the only football media highlights I have is the great Bill Walsh came by one day and did like a round table with all the scribes, and it was kind of only supposed to be, you know, like the actual beat writers, and then it's like this kid getting also let into the room. So that was a cool memory. But I did the internship at the Record in Stockton, and then I got on with Neighbors, which was, you know, kind of almost eventually became the back door to the Bee, if you will.
A lot of people here may not know what Neighbors is.
Right. So Neighbors is Neighbors still around? Or yeah, I don't think so.
Yeah.
So
R.I.P.
so sad. At least the Hornet's still going.
Yeah, exactly. We outlast.
Neighbors is it was a weekly regional section that was owned and operated by the Bee, and it was a great concept. It was just a way to provide more comprehensive coverage to all the different communities within the area. You guys know if you pick up the metro section of the B, you know, there's a vast majority of the communities they're not reaching with their coverage. So they would have like a Foothill section, a Natomas section, Arden section, and they break it down. So my job, you know, which I was ecstatic to get because it was full time and it wasn't a ton of money, but I didn't care. And the job was profiling high school athletes, and it was full time. And essentially myself, another guy, Robert Johnson, and you meet great friends in the business. We're still good buddies. And Robert and I would team up. We were the only two high school neighbors writers with Bill Patterson as our editor. And we had a 3-man team where I would drive up. It was off of Madison, off of 80 up there was where the office was. And we would find good stories all over the area. Some amazing lessons with that job too, because you're talking about, like I look back on it, I mean, I now have the privilege of telling stories of the most well-known athletes on the planet, right? Like that's a challenge in and of itself because you try to get that right. But I look back and it's like, man, you're telling good stories of 16-year-old athletes who have, like, you're trying to find a story there, and it's tough because they haven't lived very much. There's not much of a tale to be told, but you're still, you know, it tests you as a reporter. I mean, I would go, well, hypothetically, you go to Center High School, and, you know, the assignment is, hey, Sam, we got to have 3, probably say 11 to 1,200 word features, because they had a lot of space to fill back in the day. 3 features by the end of the week. And like it's a pretty heavy load. We got 5 days. You know, I got to hustle. So Center High School, let's say their football team is killing it. They've won 4 games in a row. So then the story almost mandates that we got to do something on Center, and the editor is telling you nothing more than just go find a story. So you talk to the coach, and you pick his brain, and you learn about all these different athletes, and you try to find something that by the time it's all said and done, what you're putting in the paper, you feel pretty good about, like you didn't just mail it in. So, I mean, it was challenging, and it was fun. Access issues way different. I mean, now we have press passes and security gates. This is called, you're just trying to find a guy on the field to talk to you.
How did you hone your story sense? How did you develop a sense of what is a story and how to source it, how to report it, and how to execute it in a way that will resonate with your reader?
I think the easiest tip, it's not that complicated. For one, it's just, I love the word curiosity. So like if you have zero curiosity, if you're brainstorming ideas, and maybe you make a list of 5 or 10 different ideas, I mean, if it's not moving you, it's pretty simple to say it's not going to move somebody else. Yeah. And not only that, you know, there are times when you can look at certain story ideas and you know it might play, which is a word that gets thrown around a lot now, and then like the gross version of that word is click. You know what I mean? Like, oh, that's going to click, but it does nothing for me. I don't want to do it. You know what I mean? Yeah. So that's the first thing, is following your curiosity. You know, you do spend a lot of time having to kind of almost be in your own head figuring out what questions on my beat are unanswered and do I want to know the answers to. I had a story last week that honestly was not very high profile, but I really enjoyed doing. It was about the Utah Jazz. We spend like a crazy amount of time covering just the top teams, the Warriors, the Rockets, the Cavs, the Celtics. So the Jazz and teams like that, for our platform, there's only 2 of us covering the league. It's myself and another guy back in DC named Jeff Zilgett. So those franchises get ignored by our coverage a lot. But the Jazz last summer lost a guy named Gordon Hayward. And I had always wondered, like I never heard much about, you know, the backstory on after he left. Where did that leave them as an organization? How did they handle that? And I was excited because the longer I looked into the story, in this day and age, there's so much good, in my opinion, good sports media out there. Like, say what you will about, there's too much clickbait and all this stuff. There's a lot of really good sports journalists. And so I was fired up because I assumed that somebody would have gone back and told the story of how the Jazz handled losing Gordon Hayward. Turned out there was more there that was kind of uncharted waters that I could get into. And then I did a phone interview with the general manager and what's fun is I had just done Phil's class, and it was this reminder when it comes to being a reporter to be patient with your subjects and just I talked to the GM, Dennis, I talked to him for 40 minutes. And about 20 minutes in, I'm thinking to myself, man, this is because I had gotten his permission to record the phone call. And all I could think about for a few minutes was, this is a lot of transcribing. Like, this is going to, and you're having to, fight that battle. But I just went ahead, and I was kind of feeling it. I was like, you know what? Screw the transcribing. He's being interesting, and he's getting comfortable. And so at, the 35th minute, he starts giving me the best stuff. He's a pretty reserved guy. And next thing you know, he's just sharing little details here and there. He's like, well, when Gordon actually announced, he says, as a matter of fact, we weren't even in Salt Lake. We were in the Austin airport. We were kind of stuck because we were trying to go see another free agent in Washington, D.C., but we didn't want to be out of communication. So he's painting this picture where he's like, me and two of my colleagues from their front office are grounded. We're stuck. And this stuff wrote itself because it's like, oh, I got a team that can't have its own runway, so to speak, because Gordon is ruining their plans. Those kinds of stories, the point being that I got curious about the Jazz story. I tried to chase it down. It turned out there was good material there. I mean, it's certainly disappointing when you hustle and you chase and you just can't get what you're going for. Yeah. In fact, we have a little bit of that going on right now with this Dallas Mavericks situation, with the sexual harassment, allegations that Sports Illustrated broke that story. There's a couple offshoots of that piece that we've spent a decent amount of time, pursuing, and then it's just not there, So you end up, it's not wasting time, but I mean it doesn't always pay off like you'd hope. But I think that's the biggest thing is just follow the curiosity.
Yeah, and so when you're doing an interview like with the GM, for example, and he's kind of just talking, and you're listening, and how do you know when an interview is, when you're gonna screw the transcribing, as you said?
Right.
When
right.
are you gonna just go ahead and say, let this guy talk, and just kind of really dive into it? What's the process for that?
I mean, you try to be. I'm probably guilty of being too self-aware. It was something I got to fight in terms of courteous of other people's time. So part of what that is if I sense that he's a little distracted because maybe he just got something going. A lot of these interviews, people go in thinking to themselves, this will probably be 12, 13 minutes. And then once it reaches 18, they're thinking about their kids at school and what they got to do with their day. They're kind of done talking to you. And you need to feel that, not feel it too much, because there are times when, I think you can be oversensitive to it. But with Dennis, around that 20-minute mark, and this is not a trick that I've pulled very often, but because I barely ever write about the Jazz, and because he had been willing to do the interview, I actually straight up told him, I said, Dennis, I don't want to, it's 20 minutes in, I said, I don't want to give you the wrong idea. I said, when you see this story, the vast majority of what we talked about is not going to be in the story. I said, the truth is, I just don't know enough about your program. So I basically just gave him the option to cut it off, and I was like, I'm being really self-indulgent here because I think what you guys do is interesting, but if you got stuff to do, so we had this fork in the road where I kind of was asking him for his permission to keep going, and I got him on a good day where he didn't have a lot, and he's like, no, I'm enjoying it, we're good, and we kept going, and this is rewarding too, where I got a text message today from their former PR guy for the Jazz who sent a note. It was I've never seen Dennis, share that much. Because, the story came out and had some good stuff in there.
But people like to know they're listened to, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Like to know they're being heard.
100%. Yeah. That's a skill that, you have to, it's a tough thing because you are listening, but you can't go all in on listening because then you get caught with your pants down in terms of, I don't have a next question. And there's nothing that there's nothing that kills the vibe quicker than sitting there like, okay, I don't know where we're going here, you know, because that's when the person you're talking to just starts thinking about other stuff. So it's this balance where you got to listen and not only think about the next question, but be willing to adjust on the fly, because if he takes you or she takes you down a road that you find interesting, and maybe there's a follow where there could be some really good stuff there, but you had another question planned, you know, you got to switch gears and go that direction. There's not there's no, handbook for it, but you get a feel for it over time.
You practice it, right?
Right.
And you've had plenty of practice.
Well, and I told these guys a story a few weeks ago, like Jeff Petrie of the Kings, another offshoot of this whole discussion, is like Jeff had this he was a slow talker, and he was a really nice guy, but like we'd do phone interviews, and in the beginning I was jumpy, like, is he done talking? Like, he would stop, and I would step on him in the interview, and it would ruin it, because I could tell the guy who did, this is when I was the Kings beat writer for the Bee, and the guy who had done that job before me, he was like a total vet, had done it for 30 years, had a comfort level with Jeff. And so Jeff in the beginning was real quick, I could tell, you could tell he had been comfortable with this other guy. Mm-hmm. And so here I come, not giving him his space, because he's one of those people where he literally will get halfway through a sentence, and he's a brilliant guy, went to Princeton and, Ivy League dude, but he'll just stop talking for 4 seconds, and you have to just wait. But it's like the other guy, where I learned over time that you sit there and you deal with that uncomfortable silence, and then he's giving you something interesting. Yeah. All these little ticks that you end up learning from people you cover.
Yeah, and you cover a beat where so many of the sources are coached and scripted to within an inch of their lives. They're
right.
circumspect about every
right.
last thing about what they had for lunch. I know we
right.
have some of you guys ending class, so
yeah.
Don't take it personally.
No, they told me. I'm glad. Thanks for coming, guys.
You're gonna miss the best part. So many of the sources that you will talk to for your work, I guess the beat is famous for clamming up, maybe.
Oh, yeah.
Being circumspect. So how do you navigate around that? What's your trick there?
I mean, that part's getting tougher, because I feel like part of that answer is like, the backdrop to where the industry is at right now is changing quickly. So I mentioned earlier, uninterrupted. If you guys aren't familiar, like I said, it's player-financed media. They tell some amazing stories, but in terms of objective journalism, it's changed the game. Like Draymond Green is an investor, LeBron's an investor, and so not only are a lot of times are they trained to clam up, but they don't need us like they used to. I went to Boston last week. There's a conference called the Sloan Conference, and Sharif Abdul-Rahim was there, the old Kings player, longtime vet who I covered on the Kings, and he now works for the NBA. So we had this philosophical discussion about media and how different it was now compared to when I covered him. And he was the one saying, he's like, man, like when you were our beat writer, he's like, if I had something to say, like I gotta tell you. Especially in Sacramento, because there was only one traveling beat writer. It's not a big market. So, I mean, that made my job a whole lot easier. Like, if you're mad at the coach, talk to me. If you're happy with the coach, talk to me. Like, you got to go through there. Now, I can tweet, I can do Uninterrupted, I can do Players Tribune, which is in the same genre as Uninterrupted. So it's not even just, I actually don't think, like in terms of guys clamming up, I don't really have many complaints about the way guys conduct themselves. Like I generally enjoy most NBA players, and they're like, if you get them, they can be good. Mm-hmm. But it's just, hey Sam, I gotta go. Like they just don't need you like they used to, which is why like the Durant thing that was at All-Star Weekend is even more rewarding, because you're sitting there thinking to yourself like, all he's got to do is just go do an interview, because he's a Players Tribune guy, but he's actually done Uninterrupted too. So it is getting tougher and tougher for them to need to care. So I think, for me, the lesson, the takeaway would be, it's more important than ever to establish relationships and to get yourself where you've got enough respect, where people not only want to tell their story unfiltered or uninterrupted, but if they like your style and they like the way that you tell people's stories, and they like call it a skill, call it just a reputation, then you're going to get cooperation. And it's, again, there's not a rule book to it, but I think that's huge because we're fighting. Like I'm on, not to digress, I'm on this Pro Basketball Writers Association board for the first time this year. So it's the first time that I'm personally dealing with access issues. Like I'll do meetings with the NBA, and then there's 4 of us from different media outlets. And so I'm seeing firsthand like what the discussion is when it comes to this, pro sports in general and how these athletes, I mean, Draymond told me last week, legitimately said, and we get along really well, he flat out was like, man, the day's gonna come when like guys are gonna, like, he's like, guys are pushing to not talk to you. Like,
To you?
no,
Sam,
not
or
me, no,
the
like just
media?
media. Like there are guys, there are players who just don't understand why they have to deal with the media at all. That, they would like to play the game, and then maybe they talk to I mean, you know how you have in-house TV and things of that nature. Do an interview with the in-house TV commentator and call it a day, as opposed to whether it's in the locker room or on the podium, addressing like a typical Warriors night. I'm just guessing, but you might have 37 media outlets, that are taking part in that.
Mm-hmm.
So the point being that like players are more empowered than ever, and there are plenty of them, I think, who would prefer that they kind of just buck the system and the media didn't get the access. So again, it underscores the importance of telling good stories, being fair. I don't know where it's all going because it's changing.
How has it changed what you do? How you report for
It
them?
makes it harder. Like today's a good example. Like I was supposed to do a podcast interview with a player, and not a star, but not a nobody, and just so his agent had asked me if I would want to do it. It actually fit really well with what we were going to talk about in the podcast this week. And then we went to do the interview, and the agent was going to hop on the line and like listen in. And it's just, that's when I just shrug, and it's like, and we're running up against that a lot. I told the story recently about Kawhi Leonard of the Spurs. We did an interview with Kawhi when he was in NBA China, and his uncle after the interview told us that you can't run the story unless we see it first, which we're never going to do. And it was just these uncomfortable conversations that used to happen once every 6 months. They're like every 6 days, because rather than just get mad at it, I think to understand it, what's happening is, again, it goes back to, it's like any other, it's human nature, right? Like if you are getting told yes to, I can have this, I can have that in certain places, because the sad part is, this is a whole different panel, but like I guarantee you there are mainstream media journalists who say yes to things that are journalism 101 no-nos.
Mm-hmm.
And so that sets a terrible precedent for the rest of us. So I've come into contact with athletes or agents who don't understand, like, what do you mean ESPN? Oh, I shouldn't, I'm just picking an outfit. Like, I feel like I'm dishing dirt here. No, but like I was just picking an outlet, like that they let us see the story first. Why won't you? Well, now, maybe you don't get that interview because you won't cross that line. So it makes it harder.
But, part of what journalists do is sometimes we have to tell the stories that don't want to be told, or that
100%.
people don't want told. So you see yourself going in the direction of not defying people necessarily for the sake of defiance, but, maybe entertaining or following a more adversarial role just by necessity?
I think it naturally like begs that question for sure, where I think if you want to spin it positive, it does. There's a freeing aspect to it. And one of my favorite parts of our platform is that we don't have any sponsorships with the NBA. We have no official, the league loves our platform, but that's just because they like being in airports and hotels,
Yeah.
But we have, ESPN is an official partner of the NBA. That comes with its own set of complications, and they know that. I'm not saying, they're well aware. Turner Sports and TNT, same thing. We have no ties. We are, unhindered in that way. And I do think that what'll be interesting is if you fast forward 10 years and the access gets worse and worse, I'm still only going to dig and be adversarial when it's appropriate.
Mm-hmm.
which is where, like, if you look at the Mavs situation, that is eye-opening. And if anybody didn't hear it, this is the one where it was the former CEO was alleged, he left 3 years ago, 3 years ago. But the former CEO had a lot of women, more than a dozen women, claiming that he was, sexually inappropriate for most of his tenure. They never did anything about it. And then, and this is, you want to talk about industry complications, a writer named Earl Sneed, who is a guy who I've known for years and sat at a table with the day before this story came out, who nobody knew this, but he had been involved twice in domestic violence situations, and they didn't fire him. They not only didn't fire him, they, on the second offense, the second offense was a coworker, allegedly, but he pled to a misdemeanor, and they had him working on an agreement where he would not have one-on-one contact with female coworkers. So I only bring that story up, like that has us now going, holy smokes, we might need to ask some questions about other teams. And we might need to, it's one of those, like, this is not, most likely not the 1 out of 30 aberration that Sports Illustrated just stumbled on. You know what I mean? Odds are there's at least a handful of organizations out there that have similar problems. And so I think it raises those questions. So.
Are you ready to follow that to where it leads?
Well, that's like, so the one story I mentioned that didn't go where we wanted, and is fine to share, like there's analysis to be had with the Mavs when it comes to the question of, and this is just an offshoot of the story. So we were looking into human resources and the fact that there's a guy named Buddy Pittman who was their human resources director. Mm-hmm. Well, there's something inherently wrong with the fact that in 1998, that CEO who had all these allegations around him, 98 was the first time that he got accused of sexual misconduct. They did an internal investigation. Nothing came of the investigation except a new sexual harassment policy, and then they decided to let Terdema, Ussery is his name, to let Terdema go hire his own human resources person. This was their solution. They hadn't had an HR person before, and so what do you think happened? They hired an HR guy who was his guy, and he kind of protected him all those years later. So what we were looking at was, what's the industry norm for HR staffs? And I think we're going to still keep going down this road, but they only had one. And for one, they still haven't fired that guy. He's still there. Wow. But we had talked to HR experts and tried to learn, and again, this is way outside the purview of the guy who sits courtside watching Game 7. Like, this is not sports. Now we're talking, let's get in touch with HR experts. And we learned quickly that there's a ratio essentially of like one HR person, I think they had said, per 100 employees is about what you need. And so we were quickly getting to the deduction that the Mavs were not only inappropriately staffed, but understaffed. The idea that you had all that power in one seat. I mean, that's the only watchdog in the organization. But trying to, learn about the Mavs and the way they operated, and then start asking around about other teams to compare and contrast a little bit. So that's the kind of stuff we're getting into.
Yeah, so I want to get to some questions from the audience in just a moment. That gets me to thinking about the need to have balance as a sports reporter too. You have the contacts, you have the beat, but you have to have the technique, you have to have the fundamentals.
Right.
You have to report.
Right.
And we were talking before the Q&A about your story about R.J. Adelman.
Right.
From a few weeks ago, which I thought was so interesting because we know you as a beat reporter covering the games and covering what's happening in the NBA, but then when something like this happens, maybe you can elaborate on the story. Like, how did you turn that around so fast, and what was your thinking there?
That was a hard one to do because, and it's been a weird couple of weeks. Like, in the category of non-traditional sports coverage, I don't know if I've ever had a couple of weeks like the last few. So the RJ story is one of them, and I say that to say he was the son of Rick Adelman, the longtime Kings coach, was a assistant coach for the Houston Rockets, was around the NBA for a long time. So I'm I forget where I was. I think it might have been All-Star Weekend, but I'm just looking at Twitter one day, and my heart drops when I see TMZ reporting that R.J. Adelman has been killed. And it's a name that I hadn't thought about for a couple of years, but I got to know R.J. pretty well over the years, and he was a very, very nice dude, and we shared space, and we talked a lot, like back when, if any Kings fans in the room, like when the Maloof, the Maloof brothers had the team, and RJ and I used to have like really honest conversations, because like Rick was fine, but Rick was, he'll say it, he was a little grumpy, and I never got to talk to Rick about the Maloofs. Rick would be like, Sam, what's the upside of me complaining about my owners to you? But RJ, we'd have real discussions about what it was, all the just King stuff. And so we would talk, and then I got to know him even more when he was in Houston. So this is where the job, you end up, everybody's human, right? So I'm looking at the screen, and I'm stunned. So RJ was crossing a street in Houston, and it's no more complicated than he stepped out in a crosswalk, and a lady in her 80s in a big old SUV wasn't looking, and she ran him over. And so then I call one of the guys I work with, and there's part of me that just felt like, can somebody else write this? Like, I don't want to, but I also, honestly, Stu, like my incentive, I wanted to tweet. I still have a lot of Sacramento-based people who follow me, and I felt like whether his family was on there, I just thought some things needed to be said about RJ. But as a reporter, my next thought was, I can't tweet about RJ just based on TMZ. Like, I just can't. And this is literally life and death, and I'm not going to just go off there and report. So, I called the PIO, the Public Information Officer in Houston, and got the information, confirmed what had happened. They share a few details, put the story together, and, it was obviously very straightforward, very basic, kind of inverted pyramid approach, but hard to write, sad, And then there was another one like a week later. I don't know if you saw on Twitter, a guy named Dan Fagan is an agent, who, it's wild that, Dan was only in his mid-50s, and another car accident. He was his agent, who, like, super powerful in his day, would always get guys traded, who didn't want to, like Dwight Howard wanted to move from Orlando to, the Lakers. So Dan was the one. He was a bully, and he was a bull in a china shop, and he and I spent years not getting along at all. Like, we had a hard time. And then thankfully we kind of made amends within the last couple of years, but similar experience. When I look at Twitter last week, Dan Fagan was up in Aspen, Colorado. The awful part is he was with his 5-year-old son, who thankfully is going to be okay, but his son was hurt as well, and a truck just completely T-boned him, and Dan passed away. So that was another thing where now we got to confirm the news, and we got to be reporters, even though it's a little personal.
Yeah, so it's not all courtside at Game 7.
No.
Listen,
I've covered
do it all.
I've covered the Donald Sterling situation. I was in Portland. You're talking about one of those moments where you never forget where you were. I'm in Portland, Blazers, Warriors, playoff series. Look at the screen, TMZ, Donald Sterling, N-word, and you just know immediately, like, oh my God, like are you serious? And then, then even the fact that, and this is part of the evolution of media, where it's like now we got the actual audio tape, which if this happened 30 years ago, that's not part of the presentation. So that you could have a whole nother panel on that. That turned the whole league on its head. So it's wild. We do write our columns about Durant had 37 points and looked good tonight, but I feel like at least half of what we do ends up being just life stuff.
Yeah, got it. Let's hear some questions. Who's got some? Keith, go ahead.
Yeah, so you've...
Good to see you, Keith.
Good to see you.
Took me a minute to place you.
How you been?
Hey, good.
Yeah. Sweet. I actually got two questions, but like mini ones.
Yeah.
So my first question is, the last couple of years in the league have been very exciting as far as just like moving pieces, and we love the drama that comes with the trades and
Right.
signing trades and things like that. And so my first question would be, what has been your favorite game that you've covered the last 5 years? And then my second one would be, in a result of the league being always interchangeable and always like moving, like LeBron James right now is the best basketball player in the league, a lot of people would say.
Right.
Who do you think would be the next guy that's supposed to come up, whether it's the Greek Freak or Porzingis or maybe a guy in the draft like Aiden? Like, who do you think's next in line to be that guy?
So the first question, you made a few games run through my head. I think it was game 6. It was Spurs Heat, the infamous game where Ray Allen hit the 3 in the corner. Yeah, because the game was over. And the best part, if you guys don't remember that one, it was like the Spurs had won. And they legitimately, they being staff members on the floor, like they took the caution tape or the yellow tape and they were roping off the court, which is what they do to celebrate a championship. And Ray's like, we ain't done yet. And he knocks it down. And I just, that one was insane. I think it was that same finals where you talk about memorable experiences. Again, I forget which game, but earlier in the series where it was AT&T Center in San Antonio and the air conditioner went out. And I've never been so hot in my life, even living in Sacramento all these years. Like, media people are ripping off their jackets, and one dude's like in his undershirt on press row, sweating like crazy. I mean, it was insane because our seats were at the top of the lower bowl, so the heat's rising. It's even hotter, I think, up there. But the game goes on, and that's where LeBron cramped up, which I don't blame him, and just chaos. I mean, I've been that's what ends up sticking with you more memory-wise is the chaos. This is older, but like the first NBA Finals I ever covered was 2010, Lakers-Celtics, and it was just like the ugliest game you will ever see. Like, nobody could hit a shot. Kobe missed 18 out of 24 shots. Our test, and the fun part for me was I had covered Ron all those years, and it was like Ron's redemption story, and he scores 20-something in Game 7. And, I think I'm never going to have more fun asking a question in a press conference than that night, because typically I'm funny this way. Like, I don't do the press conferences that much because the second, like, you get something good, it's on SportsCenter. Mm-hmm. So I'm always trying to catch guys one-on-one. But it was Ron, so I kind of was like, I got to have Ron's moment. And I said to Ron, like, did it feel good to pick up Kobe in this game when he had a hard night after an entire season of him carrying you guys? And I don't know if you guys remember his quote. He went crazy, and then he started screaming, Kobe passed me the ball! Kobe passed me the ball! I can't believe Kobe passed me the ball! And he just wouldn't shut up. He just kept screaming and yelling, and and I'm like, yeah, that was my question. So that was a fun one. As far as like the next generation, I don't know. It's fun. Like, Giannis is incredible. Like Anthony Davis, it's kind of like lately has been just destroying it, and I feel like reminding people that he's that guy. I don't know if he can get to that level in New Orleans. I don't know, recency bias, but honestly, like writing about the Jazz, like Donovan Mitchell is crazy in a good way. Like, he's so good, and the fun part about doing those interviews this is a young rookie, was taken 13th overall. I think is going to go down as a huge draft night mistake because the Denver Nuggets traded the 24th pick and a young guy named Trey Lyles to the Jazz, and so they could get Donovan. So Denver, Donovan Mitchell should be on the Nuggets. Instead, he's on the Jazz, and I think they're going to regret it because he's special, and the way he works is fun. So, a couple names.
Cameron.
You're talking a little bit about like the trades and stuff, and I wanted to know your strategies about dealing with like honesty from your sources, because GMs obviously have some incentive to blow smoke up.
Right.
But with like trying to negotiate in public with other GMs about
Right.
how you should value the players and stuff.
Right.
But then also, if you go back to the Dallas Mavericks situation, there was obviously some criticism of Mark Cuban after that news broke and how he handled it, saying that he didn't know anything
Right.
about the CEO, but he's obviously got a reputation for being a very hands-on owner.
Right.
And that didn't seem very plausible when he did say that. So, like, what are your strategies for receiving information that you suspect or know is an outright falsehood, and how do you approach reporting on it?
That's a really smart question. It's funny, like the agent who I mentioned who passed away, like, if I'm being honest, ironically. Like, we battled because I'd been lied to. And I'm kind of a fool me once, shame on you, fool me twice, shame on me person. And so, like, it's sometimes to my own detriment, because if I feel confident that I'm being lied to in any kind of substantive way, I kind of unofficially, like, strike you from the list. You know what I mean? And it might mean that I don't break a story or I don't have access to this athlete, but, like, I don't know how to operate if you're going to be fake. And it just, like, it is the quickest way to ruin your career if you just let somebody grab your microphone and tell falsehoods. And people know it, and I see it. I see stories every so often now where you can tell, and sometimes you feel bad for the writer because you're thinking maybe they didn't know, and you're hoping they didn't know because you certainly, So part of the answer is just being cognizant of, like, literally every single relationship. Like, if you could spit 50 names at me right now of people I deal with, I could tell you immediately, like, on a scale of 1 to 10, how much I trust them. Like, it's kind of just this thing in your head. So that's part of it. The Cuban component there, like, I wrote a column. I didn't feel great about it. I'm going to pull a print complaint. Like, we still have print deadlines, and it was, nothing like writing a super sensitive column about sexual harassment in, 57 minutes. It's not ideal. But I did at least, I think, hit the mark in terms of Mark Cuban should have known better, that's all I wrote, which is, I know what he's saying, but we have that platform and you have that ability to make an informed decision with your tone and your opinion, to just simply say, and even though, like, in the old days, it was columnist in one category, writer in another. Those lines are blurred. Like, I'm a columnist one day, I'm a writer one day, so I can't have an opinion. And, it was, no, Mark should have known better. I don't care what he says. And you can cut through all that when you decide that it fits. You want to kind of pick and choose those spots, because if you become that writer who constantly just says everybody's full of it, then I think that falls on deaf ears and that's gimmicky. But I think, that's kind of how you get through it. Yeah.
Cool. Thomas?
During weeks like NBA free agency or the trade deadline, just how busy of a week or days is it for you, and, like, how much are you working each one of those days?
It's a lot. Although it's been, free agency's turned into, like, I've figured out a pretty decent way to keep my sanity. We're lucky enough. I've got a wife and 2 small boys, and we live at the end of a court in Elk Grove. We got a really cool neighborhood with, like, all the families hang together and stuff. So the last couple of years, July 4th ends up being, like, the day where all the big guys, Kevin Durant went to the Warriors on the 4th of July. Hayward went to the Celtics. So I was, like, pulling my hair out year after year after year, like, man, this sucks. Like, I always miss out on everything because I'm stuck in my office, because it really is, like, stuff's happening all the time and you have to be on top of it. So now I've got an office that's in the front of the house with an open window, and a neighbor who thinks it's hilarious because he'll come set up shop next to my office and hand me a hot dog if it's time for a hot dog. And, so, like, we try to make the best of it. The whole neighborhood barbecues, but I'm in there grinding. You're still grinding. Like, that's a relative term. We're not digging ditches here, but, like, you're on the phone, you are constantly, so, like, on my phone, I've got probably 8 or 9 media members whose tweets are just direct notifications, where every time they tweet, it's popping up on my phone. The basic algorithm there is, like, anybody who's going to report anything that is going to require me to chase it down, I need to know that immediately. So it's, free agency in July is just like it's on steroids from what we normally do on any other day. It's like the big moments are free agency, and then the trade deadline in February is super busy, and then the draft in late June. Those are kind of the 3 times of the year when I end up disappearing.
I saw a hand over here. Yeah, go ahead.
Did you go to Kobe's last game?
I did not. I made the wrong choice.
You had a choice?
I had a choice.
Oh, no.
What
was the other choice?
Look at his face.
What was the other choice? Please tell me someone was being born.
No, man.
No?
So it was. I feel like no answer is going to suffice.
no.
It's a real answer, and I wasn't alone. A lot of media members who cover the league nationally. So, the Warriors won their 73rd game that night, and that was the first time that had ever happened in the history of the game. So it was basically like, from a media judgment standpoint, Kobe's last game, and I hate to say it because now it's like such a legendary game, scored 60 points, he was incredible. At the time, like we all, I shouldn't speak for everybody, but like we had Kobe fatigue. Like it was all year, victory lap, you know, and you kind of just felt like they're not a good team. Like the odds of him doing something special in that game seemed to be pretty slim. And so for that reason, and then also the fact that just in terms of logistics, it was like, well, I can drive to Oakland and sleep in my own bed, stay off the road for a night. Because the playoffs end up being like we're kind of, for 2 months, we're gone a lot. And so it was an excuse to stay home and not fly down to LA. But then I cover the Warriors game. You're right, I made the wrong call. And I do the Warriors game. The only silver lining was that it was really neat to see. I remember we went in the Warriors locker room. Kobe's already done his thing, and it was really cool because like the Warriors had just done something special in their own right, but they all grew up like watching Kobe. So they're in their locker room, like Steph's on his phone, like, oh my God, he did what? Like they're tripping out at what Kobe did, you know, even though what they did was, I mean, it was crazy. They were like a bunch of kids because he was an idol to them, you know. And so no, I didn't go. It was the wrong call. I should have been there.
Molly?
I used to take a student question.
You've been waiting
Yeah.
for one.
A lot of students come to this because of their love of sports, but what you do a lot is covering the NBA as a business. So what advice would you give to students who are interested in sports writing in terms of what course of study they should take and how they should prepare themselves to cover it as cover not just sports but business?
I feel like I'm like a little bit of a cautionary tale, meaning like I wish I did more. You know what I mean? Like a finance class here or there. I mean, last week at that conference I mentioned in Boston, for example, I'm in a panel with watching some incredibly smart people talk about how there's a Supreme Court case right now in New Jersey where Chris Christie is challenging the legality of sports gambling. And in the next couple of months, most likely, that decision is going to open up the floodgates for legalized gambling in pro sports. The NBA is going to be like the tip of the spear on that front, and that is going to become a huge revenue stream for them. I'm listening to this panel thinking I really should be more, you know, averse in this subject matter. And I'm having to play catch up quick. And, you know, I'm having to call smart people and figure out, you know, okay, the 1% integrity fee that the NBA is pursuing, what does that entail? At All-Star Weekend, Molly, there was a reporter from Forbes grabbing the mic and asking Adam Silver a question that just flew over my head in a heartbeat. And I just was thinking, all right, I need to, it was just relating to like the 1% integrity fee and the ripple effect on, it's going to mean 20% here and there. And us NBA media folks are just like, all right, we're out of our league here. So finance classes come to mind because it's become a $6 billion business. You know, I don't think, as much as I am glad I got a degree in journalism, I'm not one of those people that says you certainly do not have to. Like my sister was a political science major. I always kind of wish I'd gone that route because I think it would have just, if you can write, you can write, and you can get your education at the State Hornet. And I'm not trying to siphon at all from the journalism program. It's tremendously important, but this is not something where you have to have a chemistry degree to go be a chemist. Journalism is telling stories, and a lot of times what you learn in school, in other areas is going to help you. So that stuff I've had to try to grow the longer I've done it just to keep up.
Yes, go ahead.
My question was, you mentioned kind of the difficulty with, or the increasing difficulty with like access, and like what you mentioned with Draymond Green in that conversation. And now players are more open with their unwillingness to speak with the media. mine's kind of a two-pronged thing, but how do you balance like certain outlets like what like a Skip Bayless would say, and how you might get lumped into that
Right.
when that's not necessarily how you operate, and the players' general unwillingness to speak to media as a whole? How do you balance your relations with other media companies and then being lumped in maybe from an outside perspective when that's maybe not necessarily how you are?
Sure. So Kevin Durant comes to mind because one of my favorite parts about Kevin is that he's kind of a media, I don't know what the word is, but like he likes learning about the media. What's that?
You want to talk to them?
No, like that too, but he digs learning about our world, which I think in general is a sign of an interesting person, that they just look on the other side. So Kevin has told a lot of us who cover him routinely, like that he flat out asked me one time, like where are you going? Like, do you want to? He's trying to learn. He's like, you want to be Skip Bayless? Like, what do you? And he's like, it doesn't seem like it. He's like, but isn't that who gets paid? Like, isn't that? And he's trying to understand. Like, isn't that where the money is? And I'm like, yes, he gets paid a ton of money, but it's not me. I'm not doing that, you know. And so he's got an appreciation for, and this is out of his mouth, for the reporters who are in the trenches trying to learn about them and trying to actually tell their stories. That becomes currency for us, because Jamil Hill told me from ESPN, and obviously she's been all over the news this year. It's funny because Jamil had a rise, and she's the farthest thing from Skip. She's thoughtful, but she also had to do the gimmicky show type format, right? And it's funny because at the NBA Finals last year, like she and Michael Smith both were telling me how much they miss being where we are in terms of like actually talking to all the athletes, because what happens is you kind of get in the ivory tower of commentary, if you will, in the media, where the pay goes up, the reporting goes down most of the time. Not all the time, but you know, the opinions, you know, it really does become a formulaic thing. Like, all right, Stu, you're going to argue for this, I'm going to argue against this, and you just get mad. You know, like it kind of becomes that, you know. And so I have tried to use that to our advantage, where you do try to portray yourself in a way where what we're kind of doing is a little bit of a lost art, because the loudest voices, like Kevin's number one gripe with Stephen A. Smith is that he doesn't talk to him. Like he doesn't, like if you're going to kill me, call me up and ask me about why I went to the Warriors. Don't just call me a coward 27 times, you know, on global television. So I think, you know, that part helps. Do you have another one in there?
Well, and then the other one was just as far as like say like Russell Westbrook or someone like that, or even maybe like DeMarcus Cousins.
Yeah.
More closer example, someone who's had, you know, like on camera gripes with a media person or something like that. But maybe the person they're having a gripe with is like the Skip Bayless type of guy.
Oh, I see, yeah.
Or something like that. But, you know, from the player's side, if they aren't thinking about it, maybe they kind of like lump all the media in with it. So that's
Yeah.
like you said, how, you know, that's not what you're
I
trying
think most of the stuff that happens, like a locker room flare up, most of the time it's personal, like, you know, specific to that reporter. I don't know the guys, the one time of year when guys seem to kind of generally just react negatively is All-Star Weekend. Is got a ton of international media, and it's just got like that Super Bowl feel to it, where the circus component. Like I remember when Kevin, I keep going back to Durant, but do you remember when Durant got mad about Scott Brooks' question when he was in Oklahoma City? It was an international reporter who was kind of baiting him, and like those types of things that tick off the players happen more frequently at All-Star Weekend. But you know, they're pretty smart. I think they know, you know, where people are coming from. Yeah.
I have a two-part question.
Yeah.
The first one is, how do you like deal with people who like don't want you to publish the story? Like the one person's quiet uncle you said didn't want you to publish it. Like you already have the information, you have it written. So what makes you not publish it, or what makes you publish it?
I mean, on that particular one, what we had decided was that we're not going to show it to him. That's just not, that's a policy. It's not something we do. And then there was a judgment call when it comes to like taking, I always try to take the long view relationship wise. And so what we kind of analyzed was, because I hadn't done the interview, it was a guy I work with, and I said, is there any news in this interview? Did he tell us anything where it's kind of like a failure of duty if we're not reporting it? The harsh reality is it was a total puff piece about him being in China, enjoying his trip in China. Like, to a degree, we felt like this was one of those like stories that the NBA likes because they like it, the international stuff. We already almost kind of felt like we were doing them a favor to do the story, but there wasn't much there. So then it just became a thing of like, do we have every right to just run it because we already had the interview. But chances are, like, for the long view, him and his people aren't going to forget that. And so we didn't run it. I mean, and I felt fine with the call because, again, it was him talking about how he had fun playing with the kids in China. There just wasn't anything there. I mean, if he had said, I don't want to be with the Spurs anymore, then that thing would have been online within a matter of minutes. It's funny, not to pivot, this kind of relates. This one, I'd be curious to get your feedback on, Stu. Like, that Sloan Conference meeting I went to, the cliff notes on what that is, it's like sports analytics. It's a bunch of MIT students who, they write research papers trying to solve, all the different problems in basketball, and they do it in ways that, again, go over my head. And it's like algorithm, it's just a scientific view of basketball. But a lot of these guys wind up getting front office positions and being within the NBA. So at the conference, President Obama spoke. And I booked the trip like before they announced his appearance, right? Well, then, admittedly, and I'm showing my politics, but I was fired up like for him to be there. I was looking forward to hearing him talk. But it wasn't really part of the work trip. Well, the night before the panel, we get this email from the conference that went out to everybody that was like, this Obama panel is not only off the record, it's like, this thing is like for perpetuity, like you will never discuss what's said inside that room. And it became a tough question for us, where I'm sitting there like, I really want to hear him talk. But my fear was this, like, what if he says, like, for one, I have a problem with the idea that just because you sent me an email like this, I didn't agree to this.
Yeah.
I was already on the list for the event. Just because what if I didn't see the email? So I didn't know what to do. And my fear was that, like, for basketball news purposes, what if he got up there and said, I'm going to buy the Chicago Bulls next week?
There you go.
And I don't know if I probably didn't make the right call. I went, and I held my breath, and he didn't say a dang thing. Like, and it still leaked. Like, it's funny because somebody, I forget which website, but somebody recorded the whole thing, and then Deadspin had it a couple days later. But there was no there. And, for one, it was eye-opening when it comes to the difference between, like, sports are high profile. I learned through that and a couple other ways that, you're talking about national security and a guy who ran the free world for a long time. So just the level of control jumped out at you. But that was another kind of journalism ethical question. There was a lot of reporters in that room who would have been in a pickle if he said something newsworthy.
Yeah, it's a slippery slope. If you accept that context, then, are you going to accept the context where, a couple GMs or a GM wants to talk to you, it gets some GMs and some players, they probably talk to you off the record sometimes.
Oh, 100%, yeah.
So
No, like you have to remind people that you would occasionally like to do an interview.
Yeah.
Like, because it's everything. And that, I feel like that could be a whole nother class. Like, some people I deal with drive me nuts because I literally want to, like, text them or tell them, like, here's the parameters. Like, background means I'm using this information. It just doesn't have your name on it.
Right.
But all the people who will text and be like, off the record, and I know for a fact that they mean background, but then I have to, like, I have to circle back and, like, make sure you're clear,
So do you have pre-existing, like, terms with sources you have your own kind of code of, not your own code of ethics, but specific to the beat you cover and your sources, so that, you know, when they do get in touch with you, those text messages or those emails or those calls, whatever, and they say that,
Right.
they
I mean,
know
I
what
have
the
my,
context is?
I think the answer is like, I have my terminology, and I try to like apply that to them and make sure that they know how I see it, and then not obviously move forward with any reporting until that part's clear. I can thankfully count on like less than one hand the times that there's been a miscommunication. Like one though that comes to mind that's relatively innocuous is like, it ended up being a big break for me, and I kind of felt guilty because of the miscommunication. Was the NBA lockout ended in 2011, and I had an executive who was just a front office guy who was trying to be helpful. So the lockout ends, and I had hit him up and I said, hey, is there any chance that the NBA sent you the PDF of the brand new collective bargaining agreement? And this had not been published. So this is what they worked on for 6 months, whatever, however long it was, this agreement between the NBA and the players. And I just said, any chance, you know, I think the NBA is sending that around. Do you have a copy? And he said, sure. And he sent it to me. And I had dealt with him enough to know that, like, he knows I'm not going to put his name on it. What we didn't talk through, because it was a little bit unconventional, and this is when I was at Sports Illustrated, was like we just went ahead and uploaded the entire PDF, the CBA, and it was like, we have the CBA. Which, you know, in my own defense, like if you go back and look at our email string, it's like, it was pretty clear, like, I want this, I'm using this.
Yeah.
He just didn't, he just assumed incorrectly that it was, you're gonna paraphrase a few things here and there, and it's like, no, we got 72 pages, boom, you know, yeah. And it did, like, it exploded because everybody was like, oh, dang, like, we can read the whole thing, this is great, you know.
Yeah.
He just didn't necessarily mean to be the provider of the entire thing, you know, and we still get along well. So, but it's better to be safe than sorry, obviously, because the problem is if you have, like, thankfully me and that guy had a long history already, and so if we hadn't, like I had an agent last summer who I got sideways with because I was frustrated with the way he operated, and usually I'm really good at biting my tongue, and I was a little tired of working and stressed out, and I didn't bite my tongue. And it sure felt good to get off my chest, but like, take his name out of the Rolodex. Like, you know, you're not, because it's just, if you don't have history with certain people, then you don't have that foundation to kind of get through that stuff.
How often will you take comments or quotes or just take information off the record with the understanding, or at least with the confidence you'll be able to repurpose that, or at least change the source's mind, get them on the record or on background at the very least? You ever take that gamble?
Yeah. I mean, I ran into one. I keep going back to Boston. There was one in Boston relating to, not the punchline, but like, I wound up reading some stuff on ESPN that I was told in Boston, and I wasn't able to repurpose quickly enough. Now, it wasn't really I didn't really agree to be told this stuff off the record. Like, it was honestly one of those where the guy said it, and then he after the fact said off the record, and then, so technically speaking, could I have said, nope, you said it first, but it's a guy I want to deal with for years to come, so there's no end game there. But, you know, the background stuff is a major part of what we do, just because the way the league rules are set up is that executives are just not really allowed to talk about anything until deals are done. And so, to their credit, they try to help media members where it's like, there are times when, there are literally times when a trade might be agreed to 2 weeks before it happens. And if we had to wait for somebody to go on the record, we would not be able to report on our job, on these deals, which would just be silly because it's already taken place. So I feel like it's a bigger part of our operation than it is kind of your run-of-the-mill beat, the background stuff.
Got it. We have time for maybe one or two more. Sigrid, go ahead.
On the issue of prior censorship, you say it's getting worse
and having players not wanting to talk to you or agents wanting to review the material before it's published, which of course is a no-no. And
Right.
You see that in politics and legal coverage, which is my area.
Okay.
Do you think that played a role in some of the coverage that did not happen about, say, concussions or sexual harassment? I mean, in politics, for example, we've known about stories that didn't get reported for
Right.
years. You just didn't do it.
Right.
And it was kind of a good old boys club anyway.
I can only speak for myself. I don't think so in this, the specific stories you mentioned, like the Dallas Mavericks situation. Even the writer, and again, that was pretty surreal to have another media member be part of a story. It was very uncomfortable to have not known, like we bottom line, we knew nothing about what he had done. Now the CEO, I don't think it's a good old boys thing as much as, like, I talked to a guy who originally broke that story in 1998 about the allegations, and upon reflecting now, he has some regrets about not asking more questions, because it was like the way they handled the situation then was not good enough, but there wasn't a ton of dogged reporting to demand answers then. I wasn't in that market or doing it at that time, so I don't know how much of that was just moving on to the next story and how much of it was protecting somebody. Certainly that stuff happens, and I think that the revelation for sports media, NBA media, is just that idea that it's kind of like that idea that if it happened in Dallas, it's got to be happening, in other places. So trying to open eyes a little bit. Like there was another team for me where, and I don't know any specifics, but like there's another team that had a situation where you heard a few things about, this guy got run out of town and it might have been related to a similar type thing. It does kind of make you say, all right, maybe we need to actually go ask some more questions there, rather than just kind of saying, oh, interesting, and moving on. So, yeah. I
Don,
feel.
why don't you take us home?
Yeah. I was trying to get you.
I had a few
Yeah.
questions.
Oh.
No, go ahead. Yeah.
I had a few questions. We brought up Skip Bayless a couple times. Somebody that wants to go into more of the TV aspect, how would one do so? And the second one is, you mentioned, actually, do you think LeVar Ball is good for media?
Is LeVar Ball good for media? But here's the problem. He is clickbait, but he's the story. He's the father of the chosen one, Lonzo Ball, the number 2 pick in the draft. And so it's not. Man, I don't know what the answer is. I like the question. He's not. I think he forces media to look at itself, which I think is probably healthy, because even like for us, I wrote a handful of LeVar Ball columns when he kept people like getting in the news, and I wrote one column. I can sleep at night because I felt actually good about what I wrote, but like I wrote one column about LeVar and Trump battling, and I guarantee you I will never get more page views on a story ever again than like, but I never wrote anything for the sake of writing it. But LeVar tempts anybody in the business who just wants a little shine. But then the backside of that I think has happened quickly is, I'm trying to think, there's a guy at ESPN named Jeff Goodman. Jeff went to Lithuania to cover the 2 younger Ball sons. And I kind of feel like it was a case study. And again, if I keep assuming people know all these things. So you got Lonzo Ball plays for the Lakers. His 2 younger brothers are trying to get into the NBA. One of them's much better than the other one, but the 2 younger sons go to Lithuania to play. And in any conventional look at it, it's not a story for a national media outlet because Lonzo Ball's not over there. It's just it's a mediocre European player, but he's part of this family that's basically become like the Kardashians of the NBA. And so they went and covered it, and I just don't think it went very well. Like, I think it was a bad look for them. Jeff's a very good reporter, and he interviewed LeVar over there, and that's when he had the interview where he said that Luke Walton had lost the team, the Lakers coach. And I just think that we all learned pretty quick that there's a short, I don't know what I'm trying to say, the shelf life or the upside of going down that road, at least the cheap way, is not there. There has since been some really good journalism done about LeVar Ball. Like SB Nation just had a cool piece where they had somebody really dive into, you talk about it's not intentionally adversarial, but it's just honest.
Yeah, just challenging.
Yeah. So there was a European reporter who broke the story on, like, hey, by the way, the league that they're playing in is garbage. And the American media had been reporting it as if, they were almost kind of fictitiously elevating the level of play that these young Ball brothers were taking part in, because that kept the story relevant enough. Because if you told the truth, which is this league stinks, and they're not even on the top team, they're on like the JV team, then you wouldn't be able to justify spending $7,000 to go to Lithuania. And these real-time analysis have had to happen real quick. I don't know if there is, not to throw it back at you, but like, do you think LeVar's good or bad for media?
I think he's good for media just because, like, if you Google or you're on Twitter and you see LeVar, people are gonna talk about it.
Yeah.
And it just brings up conversation more so. I saw they were debating on ESPN, like, should we be covering LeVar Ball? But then they continue to cover him. So,
Listen, it's crazy. Like go ahead, Steve. No, go ahead. So like Steve Kerr before a game, like, went off on LeVar Ball, and he had a line in there. And this is like before a Warriors game. LeVar was in the news. That's when he criticized Luke Walton. So Steve used to work with Luke with the Warriors, and so Steve criticizes LeVar. And I was just trying to be a good soldier in terms of our company and just pump out a quick news story. Okay, Steve Kerr said this. It's topical. So I wrote Steve Kerr's comments. Well, one of his quotes was like something about how I've talked to reporters who say, I don't even want to write about this guy, but I have to. Like, he said that as part of his comments. And that made some people in our office kind of uncomfortable. Like, because I just wrote that, and I didn't mean that in any passive aggressive way. I was just quoting him. But it kind of forced everybody to have this dialogue, like, let's be honest about the way we're doing this. And Steve was kind of calling a spade, which is, that the temptation, because people talk about him all the time, the temptation is to cover him in a way that's not reflective whatsoever of his relevance. And I think that's where we got to find balance, because a lot of people have already been burned by taking the ethos that whenever he talks, it's newsworthy. That's not the case. I think you got to pick and choose.
We have a reception at the State Hornet newsroom over at Del Norte 1006. There's pizza. Is anyone hungry? Would anyone like some pizza? Okay, there is pizza. There is pizza. Sam, would you like some pizza?
Yeah, let's go do
All
pizza.
right.
Absolutely.
Tell you what, Sam,
Yeah.
if you're going to be around, maybe some students can pick your brain about some other stuff over
Sure.
at the newsroom.
Yeah.
And we'd love to have you join us. Sam, thank you so much for coming.
Thanks, guys. Appreciate you.